For the first actual piece of evidence for the biblical creation, we will discuss the single biggest piece of evidence for the Genesis flood. That piece of evidence is the fossil record. But the fossil record is used to support evolution, you may say. It is true that this is because they interpret it under the presupposition of universal common descent evolution. At its core, the fossil record is actually a record of the Genesis flood. To understand how the fossil record is fundamentally evidence for the Genesis flood, it is first necessary to understand that this flood, if it occurred, would have been global in scale and not some teeny-weeny local flood. Then it is necessary to consider what would be the primary thing we would expect if there had been a global flood sometime in the past. The primary piece of evidence would be billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. This is actually a perfect description of the fossil record. What really nails this down as evidence for a global flood is the fact that about 95% of all fossils are marine organisms, all found on dry land. Furthermore, 99% of the types of animals found in the fossil record have living representatives. Now, they are seldom labeled as the same species, but that is the result of a tendency among evolutionists to apply new species names to fossils regardless of how similar they are to living organisms. The way the fossil record is often depicted does not show these patterns because they're trying to illustrate the notion of universal common descent evolution. The problem is that this is more of an example of propaganda rather than science, and it tends to give people the idea that universal common descent evolution is better supported by the fossil record than it actually is. One way of looking at this is the question: if we did not already know about fossils, which model would predict them? There is nothing in uniformitarian geology that predicts the existence of fossils at all, let alone the large number of fossils that are actually found. Furthermore, from a uniformitarian perspective, once they were found, you would expect them to be exceptionally rare, but they really aren't. This is because the conditions necessary for fossilization are not common in the world we live in today. Furthermore, you would expect most of the fossils that would be found on the continents to be land plants and animals, not sea creatures. The only model that predicts that we would find lots of fossils all over the Earth, and that the overwhelming majority of them would be aquatic despite being found on dry land, is that of a global flood. That means that ultimately the existence of the fossil record is strong evidence for the Genesis flood described in the Bible. It is without a doubt the first and most critical piece of evidence for the Genesis flood.